Let me be direct with you from the outset. Of all the actors in this region whose strategic intentions have been most consistently misread by Western analysis over the past decade, Turkey is at the top of the list. Not because Turkish strategy is particularly complicated, it is, in fact, relatively transparent to anyone willing to read it on its own terms rather than through the lens of what Western governments wish it to be. The misreading occurs because Turkey is a NATO member, and the Western anti-analytical and political establishment has spent 70 years processing Turkish decision making through a NATO frame that assumes Turkey's interests are substantially aligned with alliance interests. They are not. They never entirely were. And the decision that Ankara is preparing to execute in the next 72 hours, a decision that I am going to describe in detail tonight, will make the degree of that misalignment impossible to ignore for the first time since the 2016 coup attempt, restructured the political architecture of the Turkish state. 72 hours. I am using that time frame not as a rhetorical device, but as an analytical estimate based on the specific sequence of preparations that have been observed and documented over the past week. The decision is not yet executed. The window has not yet closed, but the indicators that I am going to walk you through tonight are consistent enough across enough independent sources to say with confidence that what Turkey is preparing to do will, when it happens, change the geometry of the Middle East in ways that will take years to fully understand. Subscribe now. This analysis is going to connect Turkey's domestic political situation, its energy interests, its relationship with the broader resistance axis, and the specific military and diplomatic preparations of the past 72 hours into a picture that no single Western outlet has assembled. Let us begin. To understand Turkey's current strategic position, you need to understand what has changed in the calculus of the Erdogan government over the past 3 years. The change is not primarily ideological. Erdogan's general orientation, his mix of Islamist political identity with Turkish nationalist interest and pragmatic realpolitik, has been relatively consistent since he came to power in 2003. The change is structural. Three structural developments have altered Turkey's strategic calculation in ways that make the move it is preparing not merely possible, but, from Ankara's perspective, necessary. The first structural change is energy. Turkey is an energy importer. It is dependent on external supply for approximately 70% of its primary energy consumption, making it acutely sensitive to both price and supply security in ways that shape political and strategic decisions at the highest level. The trajectory of this conflict, the Gulf tensions, the Strait of Hormuz situation, the Red Sea disruptions, has been driving Turkish energy import costs upward in a way that is directly traceable to the geopolitical disruption of the supply chains Turkey depends on. Every month that the current trajectory continues is a month that Turkey's energy import bill grows, and that the political and economic consequences of that growth fall on Turkish households and Turkish businesses. The second structural change is the Syrian border. Turkey has been managing the Syrian situation for 15 years through a combination of military presence in northern Syria, political engagement with various Syrian factions, and the management of a refugee population currently estimated at approximately 3.5 million Syrians in Turkey. That is the largest refugee population in the world, and that constitutes a significant and growing political pressure in Turkish domestic politics. The current state of the Syrian situation is, from Ankara's perspective, unresolved in ways that the current conflict's trajectory is not improving. Every week that the regional conflict intensifies is a week during which the conditions that produce Syrian instability are exacerbated. The third structural change is Turkey's relationship with the Gulf states. Turkey's economic relationship with Qatar, with the UAE, and with Saudi Arabia has deepened substantially over the past 5 years. These relationships represent significant Turkish economic interests, investment flows, defense contracts, diplomatic alignment that are threatened by the current trajectory of regional instability. Turkey cannot protect those interests by remaining on the sidelines of Takustak Fabistagsta on Infoframe. The Iraqi side is Gisfan threatens Israel are threatening them. These three structural pressures have been building for 18 months. What has changed in the past 72 hours is the indication that Erdogan has made a decision about how to address them. Announcement number one. Turkey is preparing to deploy military assets to the Syrian border in a configuration that is not consistent with defensive or counterterrorism operations. And that signals a different operational intent. The specific deployment indicators have been documented by two regional military monitoring organizations and confirmed by Turkish opposition media that covers the military affairs with sources inside the Turkish military institution. The indicators include the movement of specific categories of armored assets to staging areas that are inconsistent with counter-PKK operations, Turkey's longstanding counterterrorism mission in the Syrian border region, but consistent with the posture required for a larger operational initiative. They include communication security protocol changes associated with preparation for active operations, rather than ongoing patrol activities. They include logistical movements, fuel, ammunition, medical in quantities and to staging locations that exceed what ongoing operations require. Individually, none of these indicators is conclusive. Individually, each has an innocent explanation. Collectively, they form a pattern that Turkish military analysts who have been covering this beat for years describe as consistent with preparation for a major operation within a defined short-term window. Received. That is announcement number one. Announcement number two, the diplomatic signaling that has accompanied the military preparations indicates that Turkey has been laying groundwork with multiple parties whose acquiescence or at minimum non-opposition is required for the operation to proceed. In the past 2 weeks, the Turkish foreign minister has made 3 trips that, reported individually, appear routine, but that, assembled, reveal a specific diplomatic preparation sequence. The first trip was to Doha, the second trip was to Tehran, the third trip was to Moscow. In each capital, the conversations were described by official communiques in the standard diplomatic language of broad consultations on regional stability. In each capital, the actual conversations, based on diplomatic sources who have described the substance to regional correspondents, was more specific. The conversation was about what Turkey is planning to do, why it believes it needs to do it, and what it would need from each of those capitals in terms of not obstructing it. The Doha conversation, according to a Qatari diplomatic source cited in regional media, focused on energy, specifically on Qatar's willingness to guarantee alternative energy supply arrangements for Turkey during a period of regional disruption. The Tehran conversation focused on the Syrian dimension, specifically on Iran's assessment of Turkish operations in an area of Syria where Iranian-aligned forces are also present. The Moscow conversation focused on the airspace and ground presence issue. Russia has military assets in Syria that any Turkish operation in that theater must account for. Turkey has, in other words, been seeking the deconfliction agreements required to execute its planned operation without running into Russian or Iranian military assets that would complicate or block it. Stay with me because this is where the narrative completely changes. Announcement number 3. What Turkey is planning to do has the potential to fundamentally alter the balance of the conflict in ways that no current actor can fully predict, which is precisely why it has been planned with such careful diplomatic preparation. I want to be precise about what the operation appears to be based on the military deployment indicators, the diplomatic preparation sequence, and the specific political pressures driving the decision. What Turkey appears to be preparing is a major military operation in northwestern Syria, specifically in the Idlib region, combined with a diplomatic initiative that uses the military operation as leverage to produce a negotiated outcome that addresses Turkey's specific interests in the Syrian file. The operation is not designed to conquer or permanently occupy additional Syrian territory. It is designed to produce a negotiated political arrangement that Turkey has been unable to achieve through diplomacy alone. What makes this consequential for the broader regional picture is timing. A Turkish military operation in Syria, launched during a period of maximum regional tension in the Israel-Iran-Hezbollah theater, introduces a new actor and a new theater into an already complex operational environment. It creates additional pressure on every actor that currently has assets or interests in Syria, Russia, Iran, the United States, through its limited Syrian presence, to manage their response to Turkey's action while simultaneously managing their posture in the broader conflict. It potentially forces diplomatic bandwidth and resources to be diverted to a new theater at the moment they are most needed elsewhere. And it creates the possibility of diplomatic arrangements that cut across the existing conflict lines in ways that none of the current parties have fully anticipated. The Kurdish dimension of Turkey's planned operation is the variable that receives the least attention in strategic analysis, and that has the most direct human consequences of any component of what Erdogan is preparing. Turkey's relationship with Kurdish political and military organizations, specifically with the Kurdistan Workers' Party and its Syrian affiliate, the People's Protection Units, has been the primary driver of Turkish military operations in Syria and Iraq for a decade. Any Turkish operation in northwestern Syria will necessarily interact with the Kurdish political and military landscape of that territory, and how it interacts will determine whether the operation produces the political outcomes Erdogan is seeking or generates a new front in an already complex conflict. The specific area of operation that the military deployment indicators suggest, northwestern Syria, specifically the Idlib region, is primarily controlled by Turkish-backed Syrian opposition forces rather than Kurdish forces, which reduces the direct Kurdish dimension of the operation compared to previous Turkish operations in northeastern Syria. But secondary effects are significant. A Turkish operation in Idlib that reshapes the Syrian political landscape creates ripple effects in the Kurdish-controlled territories to the east. It affects the political calculations of Kurdish leadership about what accommodations are possible and necessary. It affects the American relationship with Kurdish forces in Syria, which has been one of the most awkward and contested dimensions of American Syria policy. And it creates dynamics within the broader Syrian conflict that have implications for Iranian-aligned forces operating in Syrian territory. Managing all of these secondary effects while achieving the specific political objective that the operation is designed to produce requires a degree of operational discipline and political skill that Erdogan has demonstrated in previous Syrian operations, but that every new operation must demonstrate again in its specific context. Now, let us talk about what is really happening behind the headlines. Turkey's relationship with both the American alliance system and the Russia-Iran axis is the most complex of any significant regional actor. Turkey is a NATO member. It has been a member since 1952. Its military infrastructure, training doctrine, and equipment mix are deeply integrated with NATO standards. At the same time, Turkey purchased the Russian S-400 air defense system in defiance of American objections, was subsequently removed from the F-35 production program, has maintained substantial economic relationships with Russia during the Ukraine war, and has been the primary diplomatic intermediary in the Russia-Ukraine context. That produced the Black Sea grain deal. Turkey is simultaneously inside and outside the Western alliance system in a way that no other major regional actor is. That ambiguous position is not a foreign policy failure, it is a foreign policy strategy. And Erdogan is about to use it. Think carefully about what Turkey's ambiguous position allows. A NATO member that announces a major military operation in Syria does not require NATO approval. Turkey can invoke Article 5 protection from NATO while taking actions that NATO has not endorsed and in some cases actively opposes. This has happened before. Turkey's previous operations in Syria, including Operation Olive Branch in 2018 and Operation Peace Spring in 2019, were conducted without NATO authorization and over the explicit objections of several NATO members. At the same time, Turkey's NATO membership prevents Russia or Iran from treating a Turkish operation as an act of war that triggers the same response that a non-NATO operation would. Turkey moves in the most protective diplomatic envelope of any actor in this region, and it is about to move. The historical parallel is the Ottoman diplomatic position in the early stages of the First World War. The Ottoman Empire, under similar pressures of competing great power relationships and strategic uncertainty, delayed its formal alignment for months while conducting military preparations and diplomatic consultations with all parties. When the Ottomans finally entered the war in October 1914, the specific timing and alignment they chose, driven by the conclusion that the Central Powers offered more of what the Ottomans needed than the Entente, restructured the entire strategic geography of the Middle East theater and produced consequences that are still shaping the region a century later. Turkey's decision in the next 72 hours has the potential for analogous structural consequences at a smaller scale, but in a comparably pivotal moment. So where does this leave us? Three paths. Path 1, the operation proceeds as prepared, achieves its limited objectives in northwestern Syria, and produces a negotiated arrangement that gives Turkey what it needs from the Syrian file while avoiding a direct confrontation with Russian or Iranian forces. This is the best case scenario for all parties and the one that Turkey's diplomatic preparation has been designed to produce. I assess it at roughly 40%, contingent on Russian and Iranian willingness to accept the deconfliction terms Turkey has negotiated. Path 2, the operation proceeds but produces unintended contact with Russian or Iranian assets in the theater, creating an escalation dynamic that Turkey did not plan for and that complicates the diplomatic objective. This is the risk that no amount of diplomatic preparation can fully eliminate in a theater where multiple actors with different rules of engagement are operating in close proximity. I assess it at roughly 30%. Path 3, the diplomatic preparation fails at the final stage. Russia or Iran decides that the current regional situation makes Turkish action in Syria unacceptable, regardless of the deconfliction terms offered, Akfarbi, Kam, Ya, Aktre, and Turkey either postpones the operation or proceeds against explicit opposition from one or both parties, creating a confrontation that changes the nature of Turkey's relationship with the Russia-Iran axis. I assess this at roughly 30%, and it is the scenario that would most rapidly redraw regional alignments. Here are the questions I want you to take away. First, if Turkey's operation produces a new political arrangement in Syria, who among the current parties to the broader conflict benefits most from that arrangement, and who benefits least? Second, what does Turkey's willingness to take independent action in this theater tell us about the future of NATO cohesion in Middle East policy? And third, if Turkey achieves its objective in the Syrian file, what does it do next? What is the second move in the Turkish strategic sequence? The energy security dimension of what Turkey is planning to do has an additional layer that the geopolitical coverage has not adequately addressed. Turkey is a participant in two significant energy transit projects that give it structural leverage in this theater. The Trans-Anatolian Pipeline, which carries Azerbaijani gas to European markets through Turkish territory, and the existing commercial relationships with Russia that the Turk Stream pipeline has institutionalized despite the Ukraine war. Turkey's position as an energy transit hub, a country through which significant volumes of energy flow from producers to consumers, gives it a form of structural leverage that is different from, and in some ways, more durable than military or diplomatic leverage. Countries that depend on Turkish territory for energy transit cannot easily alienate Turkey without accepting significant energy supply consequences. This structural energy leverage is part of what allows Erdogan to pursue the foreign policy independence I described tonight. A Turkey that depended on a single energy supplier or a single energy transit arrangement would be more constrained. A Turkey that is itself a transit hub that multiple significant energy flows run through has a form of power that is less visible than military power, but more persistent. When Erdogan makes the move I have described tonight, he is making it from this structural position. He is not acting out of strength in the conventional military sense. He is acting from the leverage that his country's geography and its energy infrastructure have built over decades. That leverage is the foundation on which Turkish strategic ambition is being built, and understanding it is essential for understanding how Turkey's next move will play out. Tell me in the comments whether you think Turkey's energy leverage makes its planned operation more or less likely to succeed. Subscribe now and turn on notifications for all our coverage of this pivotal development. The Turkish domestic political dimension of what Erdogan is contemplating in the next 72 hours is the variable that Western analysis most consistently underweights, because Western analysis tends to treat Turkish foreign policy as primarily a product of strategic calculation by a rational state actor, rather than as a product of the interaction between strategic calculation and a specific domestic political context that shapes and constrains what strategic options are actually available. Erdogan's political coalition in Turkey is held together by a combination of economic nationalism, religious conservatism, and a foreign policy posture that emphasizes Turkish sovereignty and resistance to Western pressure in ways that resonate deeply with the AKP base. Any major foreign policy move that Erdogan makes in the next 72 hours will be calibrated against that domestic political context first and against strategic logic second. Not because strategy doesn't matter, but because in a political system as personally centered as Erdogan's Turkey, the political sustainability of a strategic move determines whether it can be executed and sustained rather than announced and abandoned. The NATO dimension of Turkey's move is the wild card that every analysis of the situation has to account for, but that most analyses handle inadequately. Turkey is NATO's second largest military in terms of personnel, controls the Bosphorus and Dardanelles, the only sea access between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, and hosts the Incirlik air base that NATO air operations have relied on in multiple theaters. Turkey's relationship with the alliance has been strained to the point of crisis multiple times during the Erdogan period over Greek territorial disputes, over the S-400 purchase from Russia, over the Halkbank prosecution in the United States, and over a dozen other friction points that accumulated over a decade of relationship management. The alliance has not expelled Turkey, and Turkey has not withdrawn because the mutual dependencies are too significant for either action to be strategically sustainable in the near term. But the relationship is not the same relationship that existed when Turkey was a frontline NATO state in the Cold War context. It is a relationship between an alliance that needs Turkey's geography and an Erdogan government that needs the alliance's political legitimacy, but that has consistently demonstrated its willingness to use alliance membership as leverage rather than treating it as a commitment that constrains Turkish behavior. Whatever move Erdogan makes in the next 72 hours will be made within that complex triangulation, not outside it. The regional actors watching the 72-hour window most closely are not the ones receiving the most coverage. Iran is watching because a Turkish move that repositions Ankara in relation to the Western alliance changes the strategic pressure on Tehran significantly. Saudi Arabia is watching because a Turkish move that alters the regional balance of Sunni political power has implications for Riyadh's own strategic positioning that Riyadh has been managing carefully for a decade. Russia is watching because a Turkish move that strains the NATO relationship further creates operational space for Russian foreign policy in the Black Sea theater that current Turkish-NATO alignment constrains. Israel is watching because the Turkish-Israeli relationship by each collapsed under Erdogan and has been partially reconstituted through back channels will be significantly affected by whatever Erdogan does in this window. All of these audiences are receiving signals from Ankara right now, and all of them are making their own calculations about what those signals mean. The 72 hours that this analysis has examined is not a window of Turkish decision-making in isolation. It is a window of regional strategic repositioning in which Turkey's move is the catalyst. Now,